Good afternoon. This public meeting of the Board Governance and Personnel Committee is being held at 30 North 3rd Street, Harrisburg, PA. By participating in this session, you're consenting to the recording, retention, and future viewing of this meeting. Although being live streamed via the internet, this meeting is a live, in-person, open to the public meeting in accordance with the Sunshine Act. The live streaming of this meeting is presented as a convenience and is not provided as the official means for public attendance. In the event the live stream fails or cannot be transmitted for any reason, the in-person meeting will continue without interruption. Please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to call this meeting to order of the Board Governance and Personnel Committee, April 28th, 2022 at 12 noon. My name's Dave Philman. I'm the chairman of this committee. Could I have a roll call, please?
Chair Philman?
Aye. Present.
Treasurer Garrity or designee? Okay, I'll come back to that. Senator Hughes or designee?
Lindsay on behalf of Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Lindsay. Secretary Thal? Secretary Vague or a designee?
Here.
Thank you, Mr. Flanagan. Treasurer Garrity or a designee?
Emma.
Okay, thank you, Treasurer. And I'll try Secretary Thal again. I've got everyone but Secretary Thal represented.
Majority, thank you very much. With that, Chris has an introduction. Chris?
Yes, I do. I'm pleased to welcome Cindy Collins here today. As you know, Cindy joined us recently as our Director of Governance and Strategic Initiatives. Cindy comes to us from New York, where she was the Chief of the Pension Administrator of the New York City Mayor's Office of Pension and Investments. And Cindy, in her new role, will be transitioning my board governance work and committee responsibilities to Cindy. So at the next meeting, we'll have Cindy basically sitting in my seat for staffing up the committee. So I'd like to welcome Cindy, and I really appreciate you coming on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to everybody for being so helpful. Appreciate it.
Too. Okay, with that, we have before you the minutes of February 25th. So a motion is in order to approve the minutes of the February 25th, 2022 Board Governance and Personnel Committee meeting. Do I have a motion to that effect?
So moved.
A second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Merritt. Anyone on the question? Hearing none. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion is carried. We'll go into the agenda, old business. 4, subsection A, serves fiduciary review and board self-assessment. Final report, implementation of recommendations. Chris Houston, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Yes, if you turn to board docs, as the chairman indicated under 4A, we have a couple of materials there we're going to be reviewing. One, as we always do, we always provide a report in your materials, a status report on where we are with the fiduciary review and board self-assessment final report regarding the implementation of the recommendations that were assigned to this committee. Before we turn to a review of the draft board consultant evaluation procedures, I do wish to note that there are just really a few remaining recommendations which we'll be reviewing at a future committee meeting. Those include recommendation that's identified as C1, which pertains to the role of the executive director in legislative positioning. We also have recommendations 1.1 and 1.2, which pertain to governance structure recommendations. And then finally, there's recommendation 8.2, which pertains to succession planning for the board direct report. So those will be presented to the committee at a future meeting. Otherwise, the report gives an update on the status of all those recommendations that we've been working through with the committee on. Next, I do want to turn to the PowerPoint that we have, and that's, if you could go to the next slide. one of the Funston recommendations was to provide for an annual performance review of the board's advisors and consultants. And the board had adopted the committee work plan procedures, which included establishing the general parameters to follow in conducting an annual performance review of those advisors and consultants. And included that for all the standing committees who oversee advisors and consultants, that in the beginning of the year, the standing committees are to establish expectations and criteria for board approval, upon which outside advisors and external consultants that are overseen by the standing committees are to be evaluated on an annual basis. And it also provides that they are to conduct an annual performance review overseen by those committees at the end of the year based on those established board expectations, with then a report to the board on the results of the review. And what we're referring to here by the standing committees and the consultants are the Finance and Member and Participant Services Committee, oversees the actuary and the third-party administrator for the defined contribution and deferred compensation plans. And then we have the Investment Committee, which oversees the investment consultants. And then finally, we have the Audit Risk and Compliance Committee, which oversees the independent auditor. So in materials, we have draft evaluation procedures, which we're asking for this committee to take a look at first, and then if you're so inclined, we would ask that you refer this to the other committees, to those specific standing committees for further review. But those procedures themselves provide for each of those committee chairs and the committee staff to conduct an annual performance assessment of the board advisors and consultants, which are to include a review of those, as I mentioned previously, board-approved performance expectations, which are established at the beginning of the year, and then such other here an echo, such other contractual duties and requirements as identified by the chair in consultation with staff.
Yeah, I think it's this.
Are we okay? It's not me. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the procedures provide as follows. During the year, staff are to track activities and deliverables against and provide feedback to the standing committee chair. The chair shall determine if progress reports are to be provided to the full committee, and at a minimum, there is a report then to the standing committee and to the full board at the end of the year to include an evaluation of the deliverables and progress on those deliverables. It also provides for any progress in annual reports to be provided to the board consultant, and the chair determines if discussion on the report, including a possible oral presentation from the consultant, is to be held. And the goal of the evaluation is to really track the deliverables, and if immediate action is needed, staff are to consult with the standing committee chair and the board chair. The monitoring evaluation process also serves to convey forward-looking expectations to the consultant to consider for the following year. If adopted by the board, it is contemplated that these performance evaluations would commence in 2023. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, since the procedures pertain to the consultants overseen by those standing committees that I referenced, staff is requesting that this committee take action to refer those procedures to each of those other committees for their review and to provide comment back to this committee for its consideration. So that at a future meeting, basically, those other committees will be asked to review the procedures and then provide comment back to this committee. And upon receipt of those comments, the Board Governance and Personnel Committee would then take those into consideration at a future meeting and then finalize the procedures for board approval. Are there any questions regarding the draft procedures or the process? Not hearing any. So I guess, Chairman, we're ready for a motion on that.
You got it, my friend. A motion is in order to refer the State Employees Retirement Board Consultant Evaluation Procedures, as set forth in the attachment, to the Audit, Risk, and Compliance Committee, Finance and Member and Participant Services Committee, and Investment Committee for review and to provide comment to the Board Governance and Personnel Committee for its consideration. Do I hear a motion to that effect?
So moved.
I hear a motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
I hear a second. Anyone on the question? Anyone on the question? Seeing none, roll call, please.
Chair Philman,
Aye.
Treasurer Garrity,
Aye.
Mr. Lindsay for Senator Hughes.
Aye.
Do we have Secretary Thal on the call yet? Nope. Mr. Flanagan for Secretary Vague.
Aye.
All yes and one absent.
Thank you very much. Chris?
Thank you. Next item, ask you to turn to 4B on the agenda, and that's this SERS Strategic Business Plan Update. As we've always done in the past, we provide as an information item the latest update on the current fiscal year strategic goals, and we also provide the full plan so you can compare it to where we are overall. I just want to let you know that we anticipate coming back to this committee in June, at the June meeting, with possible minor tweaks, changes, if you will, to the goals for the strategic plan, perhaps moving some into the following fiscal year. So we're finalizing how that will look, and then, as I said, we anticipate coming back to the committee with slight revision to the strategic plan, with a recommendation to the board, since it's a board-approved plan, for the board to adopt any minor modifications to the strategic plan. So anticipate having that come before you in June then. Otherwise, unless there's any questions, that's an information item, the materials that are in board docs. Okay. That's all on that.
Okay. Number 5, special presentations, classification and compensation study update. Katie, I guess you take this one.
Certainly. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. Time flew by with me. I'm Katie. I'm the HR Director for SERS. For our board members and designees following along, as you heard Chair Philman mention, we are up to item 5A. Joining us this afternoon, we have Joe Rice, Director of Compensation Consulting with CBIZ. CBIZ is the firm engaged to complete a classification and compensation study of our investment professionals and our attorneys. Joe will be providing a brief overview of work completed to date, as well as introducing some policy and procedure concepts for consideration as we progress with the project. Our hope for today is to gain general buy-in from the committee on compensation philosophy and on the peer comparator group. With that, I'll turn the meeting over to Joe.
Thank you, Katie. And I think you did a great job summarizing what we want to review here today, so I think we can just jump right in. If you can go to the next slide. So again, the agenda for us to look at is, one of the steps that we completed was different leader conversations with the goal in those conversations to understand what the talent dynamics look like currently. So how do employees come into the organization? How do they progress? Where are some of those pain points with being able to attract and retain qualified employees? So based on those conversations, we'll share some of the highlights for the respective groups. We'll then explore compensation philosophy. So as we've had our conversations trying to understand who you compete with for talent, what that looks like in terms of industry, geography, and size, but also how you want to compete in the market, what is your strategic market placement. We'll explore those different topics, as well as what we have pulled from our survey data as the proposed peer group. And then finally, we'll close with some policy and procedure considerations. Next slide, please. So to recap the department leader interviews, excuse me, I'll start with the Office of Financial Management. And one of the themes that we heard, a few of the themes that we heard coming out of that conversation was that the way the way that the jobs are currently constructed, there is not the opportunity to bring in lower level, entry level roles and build up that talent internally. It's constructed that they have to hire in more at like an intermediate to senior level. So they're always having to go out to market, look for higher level skills, pay higher level compensation versus being able to build some of those skills internally. So we'll be looking at we'll be evaluating benchmarking data based on jobs that fit some of those entry level roles, as well as exploring a manager level that would oversee the investment accounting function. I guess it's important to highlight here, we are not proposing job organization design. It's really evaluating to say, as we look at the positions, we do see, based on conversations with the leaders, we see some gaps, and we can evaluate what a job would look like to fill those gaps and market competitive pay at that level. We're not, though, proposing to add staff, remove staff, reallocate staff. We're just simply highlighting what market competitive pay would be for those new options. So with Office of Financial Management, again, it's looking at a couple entry-level roles to bring someone in who has very minimal experience, has the ability to grow, and then also looking at a manager-level match. Next slide. Within the investment teams, it's really a similar conversation that we're going to look at some additional job leveling to fill out that career path. And it's really a similar mix to what we saw in some cases with financial management, where we need a couple individual contributor levels that have the ability to show growth with employees within the investments function, and then also potentially another kind of middle management, almost senior leader type level that we can map. Another factor that came out of that conversation was aligning the base pay for this group. So when we think about designing the pay structure, aligning base pay to be competitive at market levels that include base plus bonus. And I can talk about that more a few slides in. That's something that we'll come back to. Next slide. And then within the legal team, really, we heard feedback, and as we looked at it, that the existing job architecture, right, so as employees come in and they progress, that it's pretty well built out to serve the needs of the department. It did come across that they're eager for some of the flexibility that's going to come with having the authority to make some decisions outside of the state classification system. And another thing that we heard is that there's a strong preference for internal equity, regardless of specialty. So within the legal field, depending on the background and specialty, you may see some market differences based on that. But there's a strong preference to align based on peer levels. So where we see similar qualification, expectations, experience, scope of role, to align compensation around that. Next slide. So moving on to the compensation philosophy discussion, one of the things that we need to evaluate is how we set the market comparison point. And so what that means, I just got a 5-minute warning too on our presentation. As we think about the market comparison point and saying, as we assess market competitive pay, how are we going to use that data to build market competitive pay ranges? And so what we heard in general is that you want your pay to be market competitive. You're not trying to be the highest payer in the market. You're not trying to be a bottom payer and make up for it with other benefits and perks and culture. Salaries need to be competitive. And so we take that to mean aligning compensation at the market 50th percentile. That's what most organizations do. There's survey data that indicates, close to 90% of organizations build their salary structure around that market 50th percentile. And so it's the approach known as matching the market. I do have a visual on the right showing, a plot of what the market data might look like as we line it up. So we focus on different market percentiles. That's part of what we pull into our analysis. And so at the 25th percentile, that's where if we line up the peer group, that's the point in that grouping where 25% of the peers pay below that amount and 75% pay above. The 50th percentile is that point where half pay more, half pay less. And at the 75th percentile, you still have 25% of the peers that pay above that rate and 75% pay below. So we usually look at the 25th to the 75th percentile as that middle competitive half of the market. And again, based on our conversations, aligning compensation at the market 50th or building a structure based on the market 50th percentile is what we would recommend. So you can kind of visualize, if you think about, 25th percentile pay is low and 75th percentile pay is high. If we pick a different market percentile, right, if we were to say the 40th percentile, the structure is going to be anchored a little bit lower to market. If you wanted to do something like the market 60th percentile, it's going to move through that market range. The structures will align at that level. Now, going back to some of that nuance that we talked about with investments, there's not incentive pay for the investments team. That is something that is to some degree common with other public pension funds. When you have that incentive plan in place, it does come with some complications of managing, tracking, issuing those payouts. There's also member and media perception that you need to manage, besides broader concerns of, is incentive compensation for investment professionals appropriate, right? Do you want to encourage risky short-term behavior, or how do you keep the focus on the long term? There's a big debate there. So we do have other clients, and we see with other public pension funds, that they set their base pay philosophy to be competitive at market total cash compensation. So total cash compensation is just a term for base salary plus any short-term incentive pay. So any bonuses that you would see paid within a year. So we can design the base pay structure to be competitive at that base and bonus level. So you're not going to have, with that, the incentive compensation is to some degree baked into base pay, right? That's part of the model. But you don't see those extremes of the sort of, when the bonuses pay out at maximum or when they pay out at zero. You don't have that variability, so it's going to be more consistent from an employee pay standpoint. So that is a way that you can take the influence of incentives that you see in this competitive space, that you can incorporate that into your compensation philosophy without having to implement a bonus plan for the investment professionals. We see incentive compensation as, just as we look at the survey data, it is more of a component of pay for the investment professionals than it is for other job functions, which is why we've put that as a consideration for the investments team, but not financial management and legal. It is a valid conversation there as well. But just based on some of the market demands, incentive pay is more a factor of compensation for investment professionals than some of those other job functions. So that is something that we can evaluate. If there's any, any opinions one way or the other on that approach, this is an opportunity for me to hear from you whether or not this approach is meeting your expectations and is in line with where you want to see the compensation philosophy move. So I can pause here just for a moment to see if there's any comments on that dynamic. Okay. Well, we can move on.
Oh,
I'm sorry, was there? Okay, we can move on to the next
I forgot
slide.
that I'm not on the committee. Quick question. In the past, there have been some real benefits that state government employees receive. Health care, time off, vacation, that kind of thing, pension benefits. And does the level of benefits, do you ever factor that in when you're looking at compensation? And the reason I'm asking that is that our benefit package in recent years, in the last, 12, 13 years, has changed quite a bit in Pennsylvania.
Sure. So yes, benefits is something that we can evaluate that's not anything that's currently included in the scope of this project. When we evaluate benefits, we think of basically what we build is an enhanced fringe formula. So you can think of the medical and medical related benefits as a average cost per employee, right? Because that is a benefit that is not tied to compensation, right? You can be the lowest paid employee or the highest paid employee. If that employee elects family coverage, CSRS is on the hook for that benefit to both employees equally. But when it comes to retirement or putting a value to a day not worked, those are more variable cost elements that are tied to salary. So within PTO, we could look at things like holidays, sick pay, vacation schedules to compare that to the market. The retirement information can get really tricky to benchmark very well because there's a lot of variables that go into that. We can look at certain cost models, but that can sometimes be more legacy issues than current benefits, so it can be hard to get a good comparison there. I do understand that benefits may have changed significantly in the past 10 or 12 years, but I think that has been a pretty broad change, that a lot of organizations have seen over that same time period. I know there have been changes to the retirement plan as well. That has been something that has come up as, a differentiator between employees who have that legacy benefit versus the new benefit. So that's a long-winded way of saying, really we're focused on understanding base and bonus. We do acknowledge that there are those other reward components, but those are sort of outside of the scope of what we're looking at here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, you can go to the next slide, please. So another factor that we need to think about as part of the compensation philosophy is how we set the labor markets. So when you think about the labor market, it is broad, really. It's all employment transactions in the United States. And so we want to narrow that down to something that's going to be more meaningful to CSRS. And so what we've outlined is, from a geographic standpoint, the Harrisburg labor market is important. So many of the jobs you're going to be able to recruit within that local labor market. But as we want to compare to other public pension funds, we need to broaden that geographic scope to get more of a national feel. And it's not uncommon when you're talking about some of the more specialized positions within investments, or, once you get to more of the senior leadership level jobs, that geographic footprint, if you were to recruit for another employee, can get pretty broad. So we're including some national data there. From an industry standpoint, it's really focused on other public pension funds, as well as the broader public sector. So somewhat of a narrow view there as well. Organizations can approach that differently to say, whether it's jobs in legal, accounting, or investments, you compete beyond just these public sector or public pension employers. So that might be a consideration to bring in more of that broader labor market influence to see how that might impact compensation. But for now, we have that more public focused. And then size is a consideration as well. That's more correlated with executive compensation, where you can see multiples of pay, based on the size of an organization. From a staff standpoint, it tends to not be as impactful. It might have a little bit of an influence, but certainly not the degree that you would see with executives. So we're evaluating things like your assets under management or number of employees to establish comparisons. So the $35 billion is based on data that we collected nearly a year ago that was taken at a point in time. I think it's higher than that now, so that might be a little bit dated. But that is generally what we're aligning as our approach to the labor market. Okay, next slide. So on this slide, it's a lot of information, but this is what we have proposed as our list of peer funds. So it's a pretty big list. We collect data once a year from public pension funds across the country. And so in our survey, we have 73 public funds from which we want to pull out what we think is going to be a better representative peer group. We collect data for things like assets, members, number of employees, location certainly, but also some of this board governance structure. So whether or not the fund has the ability to set pay internally, or if that is sort of out of their control. So we've proposed what is a slightly broad peer group. We think it's going to give us good snapshot of that public pension space by having a larger peer group. We did focus that on assets under management. So we're looking at a range to establish, kind of a group that's going to be competitive or comparable. We take into some of those other factors that we discussed as well. It would be great to have more of a in-state type thing, but there's just not enough pension funds within the state for that type of comparison. So this is where some of that national influence is going to come in. I know it's a lot to take in initially. I'm not sure if you've had the chance to review this in advance, but if there's any feedback, sort of one way or the other on up here that you think would be great to include or exclude, I'm open to that type of input. Okay, next slide. So up till now, I think that is really establishing the rest of our process, right? So if there isn't any kind of broad objection to outlining the labor markets and the market placement and the peer group, then that really sets us on the path that we'll kind of move forward with that compensation benchmarking. And then the next step would be kind of reporting back internally to begin with what we see as market competitive pay, salary structure design, and an implementation plan. But that process is going to follow really the roadmap that we just mapped out with some of those earlier slides. So the next part of today's conversation is previewing some policies and procedures. If you can go to the next slide, please. A lot of this is going to be focused on the salary increase process, right? So you're going to have flexibility through this process to determine what that looks like. We have 3 different groups that are part of this, autonomy process where you can set pay internally. And so the question is, what do we do? Overall, we would recommend that, for ease of administration, but just also alignment culturally, internally as an organization to establish one process for these 3 different groups. So some of the considerations when you think about how to manage that salary increase process, we've identified 3 different general types of increases. The first is what we call a general increase. So that can be COLA, the cost of living adjustment, or it can be an across the board. It doesn't have to be tied to cost of living. But that's essentially where all employees receive the same amount. It's that spread the peanut butter approach where there's not any differentiation on what that increase is. It's provided to all employees. That type of increase is easy to administer. It doesn't take a lot of thought to figure out who's going to get what % increase, but it can be discouraging to high performers. They're not feeling rewarded for their extra contributions, and it can be pretty slow at advancing pay. So when you think about the dynamics of you tend to bring new employees in lower within that pay range, it takes a long time to advance them through that market range of pay. So to get them to market, which is what you should think of really as the midpoint, that's your goal, can take a long time. Another method would be step-based increases. And so that's where, based on, typically it's based on employee tenure. So as an employee has an additional year of experience, they're going to move to the next step in the pay structure. So the range is broken up into discrete steps. It can be good because it has equal outcomes. It's going to reduce internal competition. And there's some predictability to employees of what their future increases are going to look like. Again, it's going to be discouraging to high performers. They're not going to feel rewarded for their efforts again. And it can be expensive and unresponsive to trends. And so what I mean by that is if you go on record with steps and you want to say that employees will move 3% from step 1 to step 2, we're going to recommend on top of that annual structure updates. So your entire structure should move in order to maintain its market competitiveness. And you have that compounding effect of the structure moving plus the step movement, that these increases can be very expensive. And so sometimes what we see as a result of that is that an organization will freeze the structure movement. Employees might move a step, but the structure stays fixed. And so over time, then that structure is less competitive to the market. And then the third approach is merit pay. So, broadly, that is going to provide you efficient use of your resources. You're going to allocate that money where needed based on employee performance, that can do a better job of moving employees through that range of pay. And those high-performing employees are going to feel rewarded for their contributions. Some of the cons that you commonly hear is that it can be unfair, right? There's that rater subjectivity that goes into the process. And it can create some competition and self-interest, so that now that there is a sort of fixed pool that people are fighting for, you can get some of that competition. Next slide, please. So with that backdrop, there's a few things that I want to talk about related to different ways that you can incorporate merit pay, which is broadly what we would recommend. So one approach would be to provide increases as a percent of pay or as a percentage of midpoint. So differentiate pay based on performance rating. And so you can apply that increase either based on the employee salary or as a percentage of midpoint. Either one can be effective. And then the second consideration, which is what we typically provide as a best practice, is a salary increase matrix. And so this is where you can differentiate based on two factors. One, employee performance, and then two, employee range placement. So I have more on that on the next slide. So the matrix that we have here is just an illustration of what that would look like. So the core principles as you design a merit matrix, first you want to allocate your limited reward dollars to those employees who drive the most value, right? So the higher the performance rating, the higher the increase. The second part of that is you should evaluate where employees are within that pay range. So you essentially create different quartiles. And so the idea is that when you have employees who have the same performance rating, if you give both of those employees the same increase, they're paid differently. So if you have one employee low in the range, one high in the range, if you give them both the same increase, you're saying that they perform equally, they're paid differently, and you're doing nothing to close that gap. So by providing larger salary increases to those employees low in the pay range, you can start to kind of close the gap on those pay differences. The other thing it's going to do is, again, you should think of the midpoint of the pay range as your goal. You want to get employees who are low in the range up to that midpoint. And so by providing larger salary increases to those employees low in the range, you're going to help accelerate that movement to the midpoint, after which those increases can start to tail off. And then the third core principle, and this is a squishy one, is that it needs to remain budget neutral, right? And so when you create a matrix that's mocked up on this slide, at times you might need to shave some of those points, so that as you look at employee demographics, you might need to adjust some of this, that the overall increases fall into your budget number. Now, I say that's a squishy principle because you can use this to build your salary increase budget. You could say, let's establish a matrix that we think that does a good job of rewarding employee performance and moving them through the range, and then we'll see where that falls out, and we'll try to get that budget approved. So this is something based on the conversations that there is a difference of opinions between the different department leaders. And so we have not, while we recommend the merit matrix, we're still having that discussion on, what is going to be the best fit for the three different functions. Okay, next slide. Okay, a couple final notes on the merit matrix. So we always think of that as a guideline. There can still be room for manager discretion. So it can kind of point in the general range of where the salary increase should be, but the manager can provide some discretion on that. It can be difficult to balance within smaller departments. So typically we would say it just needs to reconcile over the entire organization. Being that these are like three somewhat smaller departments, it might be hard as well to balance the salary increase budget over that pool. And it works best like when an organization is mature in this process. And so if we were to implement this initially, and most employees are low within the proposed pay ranges, it's going to be hard to have, ideally you need an equal number of employees above the midpoint as below to offset some of that. And then, there's kind of the conceit as well as you need some poor performers to subsidize the increases for the higher performers. And so that can be a challenge with smaller departments where you really can't carry poor performers for that long. Next slide. Yeah, okay. So, we're still at a point where we need to flesh out some of that. We don't have a strong recommendation now, but at least wanted to preview some of those concepts, as that will likely be something that comes up later in this process. So if there's any questions about the salary increase types or our approach to what or our documentation of what we've heard as labor markets, I can take those now.
Any questions? Joe, I think it's really rounded out everywhere we're looking for, especially the peer issues. So hopefully your final report will enlighten us even more.
Great.
Anybody? Okay, Joe, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on. Take care.
Okay. Katie, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I have nothing. Thank you.
Okay. We would now, there is no new business, but we do have an executive session coming up. So Chris or whoever, can we set up for the executive session?
Joe will take care of that.
Yes, the Sunshine Act allows an executive session to discuss any matter involving the employment, appointment, termination of employment, terms and conditions of employment, evaluation of performance, promotion, or disciplining of any specific current public employee of SCRS. The scheduled executive session is to discuss the performance and possible salary increases for 2 employees in the Office of Financial Management, which is an authorized subject for an executive session under the Sunshine Act.
Before we enter into executive session, please give us a minute to make a few technical changes here in the boardroom on your behalf. We will make you aware when the appropriate changes have been successfully made and attendees have been taken out of the Teams meeting. Thank you. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and is now being live streamed. Thank you.
All righty, we are back in public session. Do I have to make an announcement here, Chris, about what happened here?
I think we could just say that we had a discussion over investment professional pay adjustment in executive session.
Okay, and it's been said. So we will now go into the motion. A motion is in order to approve and grant Senior Investment Accountant Michelle Crow an increase to $54.38 an hour, effective May 7th, 2022. Can I hear a motion to that effect?
So moved.
I hear a motion. Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
I hear a second. Anyone in the question? Anyone on the question? Hearing none. Roll call, please.
Chair Philman,
Aye.
Treasurer Garrity,
Aye.
Mr. Lindsay for Senator Hughes,
Aye.
Secretary Thal, and Mr. Flanagan for Secretary Vague.
Aye.
All yes and 1 absent.
Thank you very much. In a second, a motion is in order to approve and grant Senior Investment Accountant Kathleen Swales an increase to $54.38 an hour, effective May 7th, 2022. Motion, please, to that effect.
So moved.
I hear a motion. I hear a second. Anyone on the question? Anyone on the question? Roll call, please.
Chair Philman,
Aye.
Treasurer Garrity,
Aye.
Mr. Lindsay for Senator Hughes,
Aye.
Secretary Thal, and Mr. Flanagan for Secretary Vague.
Aye.
All yes and 1 absent.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate that. Item number 8, comments, concerns, questions. I have none. Does anybody have any from the committee? Seeing none, that ends our business for today. Our next committee meeting is on June the 3rd, 2022. Do I hear the motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I hear a motion. I hear a second. All in favor, aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Motion carried. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate we weren't too late today, so thank you.
Thank you.